HOA Karen decided that morning that my 16-year-old daughter jogging through her own neighborhood was an act of defiance that needed to be crushed. She didn't hesitate, didn't warn, didn't ask a single question before escalating straight to police intervention. By the time my daughter realized what was happening, blue lights were washing over her face, and a stranger was telling her to put her hands behind her back. HOA Karen stood a few steps away, arms folded, watching like a satisfied supervisor as metal cuffs closed around a child's wrists. In her mind, this wasn't cruelty. It was authority being exercised exactly as intended. She believed she was proving a point about order, compliance, and control in her perfectly curated suburban kingdom. What she failed to understand was that this single decision had just detonated her entire world. She thought she was humiliating a teenager. In reality, she had declared war on me. The phone rang while I was standing in my kitchen, the early morning quiet still intact, sunlight just beginning to touch the countertops. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? My daughter's voice was swollen, shaky, and carefully controlled in the way only someone trying not to cry can manage. She said, "Dad, they arrested me, and nothing else in my life has ever landed with that kind of weight. I didn't shout, I didn't curse, and I didn't move at all. Something inside me went perfectly still, the way it always does right before a long, methodical dismantling begins. I asked her where she was, who had done this, and why, keeping my tone even, because panic would have helped no one. She told me it was the HOA president, HOA Karen, and that the reason given was trespassing while jogging on a public street. I could hear the humiliation bleeding through her words, the confusion of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. She told me HOA Karen had insisted, loudly, that this was about community standards, as if repeating the phrase made it lawful. She told me people had stopped to watch. That was when I understood that this arrest wasn't about enforcement at all. It was about spectacle. HOA Karen is the kind of person who mistakes proximity to authority for ownership of it. She is the type who memorizes bylaws not to keep order, but to keep people small. To her, the neighborhood is not a community. It is a controlled environment, and every resident is a variable to be managed. My daughter, jogging in a hoodie on a cool morning, had become an unacceptable variable. HOA Karen didn't see a child. She saw a disruption, something that needed to be corrected publicly so others would remember their place. When she called the police, she didn't present facts. She presented certainty. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged, who had never been told no by anyone that mattered. The officers responded the way they always did when HOA Karen called, with immediate compliance and unquestioned trust. They didn't verify jurisdiction. They didn't question the accusation. They followed the path of least resistance, and that path led directly to my daughter in handcuffs. As my daughter spoke, I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. The cruiser idling, the neighbors slowing their cars, HOA Karen standing just close enough to be seen as involved, but far enough to avoid responsibility. She wanted the image burned into memory, a warning to anyone else who thought the rules might not apply to them. This was not her first display of power, just her boldest. She had built her reputation on small humiliations, on citations that went nowhere but frightened people anyway, on the quiet pleasure of watching residents back down. That morning, she escalated from paperwork to punishment. She crossed a line she didn't even know existed. When the call ended, I stayed exactly where I was, staring at the wall as the house remained painfully silent. I let the anger arrive without feeding it. It wasn't explosive or emotional. It was cold, sharp, and deliberate. This was the same anger I've felt sitting across from corrupt officials who believed their titles made them untouchable. The same anger that has fueled every successful prosecution of my career. HOA Karen had no idea who she was dealing with, and that ignorance was going to cost her everything. She thought she had embarrassed my family. What she had actually done was activate the full weight of the law against herself. I have spent my entire professional life dismantling people who abuse authority. I know their patterns, their tells, and their blind spots. They always believe their power is local, insulated, protected by obscurity. They always think no one important is watching. HOA Karen had operated in that comfort for years, unchecked and emboldened by silence. She never considered that one of the residents she enjoyed controlling might be someone who understood the system better than she ever could. She never imagined that the father of the girl she arrested would be the exact person trained to turn institutions against abusers like her. That assumption was her fatal mistake. As I drove to pick up my daughter, I didn't rehearse arguments or speeches. I reviewed timelines, statutes, and precedents. Every red light felt longer, not because I was impatient, but because I was already building the case in my head. This wasn't going to be resolved with a phone call or a complaint letter. HOA Karen had elevated this to a matter of public record and criminal exposure. Once you involve police, once you restrain a minor without cause, there is no quiet way back. She had forced the situation into the open, and the open is where I am most dangerous. When I saw my daughter, the cuffs were gone, but the damage wasn't. Her wrists were red, her posture guarded, her confidence shaken in a way that made my jaw tighten. She tried to downplay it, tried to sound brave, and that hurt more than her tears would have. I told her to get in the car, told her she was safe, and told her this was not over. She asked me if she had done something wrong. That question alone justified everything that came next. HOA Karen had not just abused power, she had taught a child to doubt her right to exist freely. That kind of harm doesn't get warnings. By the time we got home, the decision was already made. There would be no negotiation, no mediation, and no forgiveness. HOA Karen had turned a jog into a criminal accusation, and I was going to respond in the only language she understood. Law, process, consequences. She wanted to feel powerful. She was about to learn how powerless she actually was. This was only the beginning. I did not become the kind of man HOA Karen collided with by accident, and I did not wake up one day suddenly capable of dismantling institutions that abuse power. That capacity was built slowly, deliberately, and painfully over decades spent watching what authority does to people who believe it belongs to them. Long before my daughter ever jogged down that street, long before HOA Karen ever memorized a single bylaw, I had already devoted my life to hunting the exact personality she embodied. People like her don't appear suddenly. They grow in the cracks of systems that go unchallenged, and I have made a career out of sealing those cracks shut. For more than 25 years, I have worked inside the state's prosecutorial machinery, not at the edges, not in the low-level corners where mistakes are forgiven and consequences are light, but at the center where abuse of power metastasizes. I did not spend my time arguing traffic violations or cutting deals with petty offenders. From the beginning, I gravitated toward cases that made other prosecutors uncomfortable, cases involving officials, administrators, officers, and executives who believed their positions insulated them from scrutiny. Those are the cases that come with pressure, with phone calls from people who expect favors, with quiet warnings about career consequences. I learned early that if you flinch once, they smell it forever. Over the years, I built a reputation for not flinching. I learned how corruption hides behind procedure, how unlawful behavior is dressed up as policy, how the language of governance can be twisted into a shield for cruelty. I learned that the most dangerous abusers are rarely loud or dramatic. They are calm, confident, and certain that the system will protect them because it always has. My job became learning their certainty better than they understood it themselves, then dismantling it piece by piece until there was nothing left but exposure. Eventually, that reputation carried me to the Public Integrity Unit, a division most people don't even know exists until it's too late. We are not reactive. We don't wait for scandal to explode. We look for patterns, for quiet inconsistencies, for systems that seem to function too smoothly. We investigate officials who think they are untouchable because no one has ever told them otherwise. When my unit opens a file, it is not to negotiate. It is to determine how far the rot spreads and how cleanly it can be cut out. Inside the courthouse, I am not dramatic. I don't raise my voice, and I don't posture. I let evidence speak, because evidence does not blink. Judges know my work. Defense attorneys know my work. The ones who have faced me before know that I don't chase headlines, and I don't miss details. I have ended careers with footnotes, dismantled empires with accounting records, and watched men who once commanded rooms shrink into silence when they realized the system they relied on was now pointed directly at them. Power abusers always think they are unique. They never are. That professional life is not something I brought home with me. I never wanted my daughter growing up in its shadow. I chose that neighborhood because it was deliberately unremarkable, a place that felt insulated from the ugliness I deal with every day. I wanted her world to be boring in the best possible way, filled with routine, safety, and the assumption that adults behaved reasonably. I never talked about my cases at the dinner table. I never brought files home. To my neighbors, I was just another quiet homeowner who kept to himself and waved politely. That separation mattered to me more than anything. I had seen what happens when children grow up absorbing the paranoia and cynicism of power struggles they never asked to be part of. I wanted my daughter to believe that rules existed to protect people, not to control them. I wanted her to feel safe jogging down her own street without wondering who might decide she didn't belong there. That belief, that sense of safety, was something I guarded fiercely, and HOA Karen shattered it in a single morning. What she did was not just an insult or a misunderstanding. It was an intrusion into a space I had intentionally kept clean. She dragged the exact kind of authority abuse I spent my life fighting directly into my home. She took something abstract and theoretical, something I usually confront in courtrooms and reports, and made it personal by putting her hands on my child through the machinery of the state. In doing so, she didn't just anger me, she activated me. People like HOA Karen operate under a very specific illusion. They believe power is defined by proximity, by titles, by who answers the phone when they call. They mistake routine compliance for legitimacy and silence for approval. Over time, that illusion hardens into certainty. HOA Karen had spent years issuing citations, intimidating residents, and watching people back down, and every retreat reinforced her belief that she was untouchable. No one had ever forced her to confront the difference between authority and legality. My entire career has been about that difference. Authority is what people think they have. Legality is what survives scrutiny. HOA Karen had built her identity on the former and never tested it against the latter. She had no idea that the father of the girl she arrested was someone whose professional instinct is to test exactly that kind of unchecked confidence. She saw a teenager jogging. I saw a textbook example of abuse under color of authority waiting to be documented. When my daughter asked me if she had done something wrong, something inside me settled into place. This was no longer about anger or revenge. It was about restoring the boundary that had been violated and ensuring it could never be crossed again. HOA Karen had taken advantage of obscurity and fear. I was going to introduce visibility and accountability. She had no concept of how thoroughly her actions fit into patterns I had dismantled dozens of times before. By the end of that day, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. Every experience I had accumulated, every case that had taught me how small tyrants fall when exposed to real oversight, came into focus. HOA Karen believed she was enforcing standards. I knew she had just handed me jurisdiction, and once someone like me has jurisdiction, there is no version of the story where the abuser walks away unchanged. HOA Karen did not build her control overnight, and understanding how she operated required stripping away the polite language she hid behind and examining the machinery she relied on to intimidate people into compliance. To outsiders, the Oakage Landing Homeowners Association looked like any other suburban organization, a collection of meetings, newsletters, and carefully worded emails about lawn care and paint colors. Inside, it functioned as a pressure system designed to keep residents anxious, uncertain, and dependent on approval. HOA Karen sat at the center of that system, not as a caretaker, but as an enforcer who thrived on reminding people that their comfort was conditional. The foundation of her power was fear, disguised as order. She understood that most people do not want conflict, especially not with an entity that can confine them, threaten liens, or make their daily lives uncomfortable in small but persistent ways. HOA Karen weaponized that reluctance expertly. She issued citations not to correct behavior, but to establish dominance, often for violations so minor they bordered on absurd. Trash bins left out too long, curtains that didn't match an approved pallet, guests parked a few inches too far from a curb. Each notice carried the same unspoken message. I am watching you, and I decide what happens next. She reinforced that message by creating the illusion of omnipresence. Residents reported feeling monitored, even when no one was visibly enforcing rules. HOA Karen encouraged this paranoia by leaning heavily on documentation, photographing yards, driveways, and doorsteps as if she were collecting evidence for future use. The point was not enforcement, it was psychological pressure. When people believe they are always being observed, they begin to self-censor, to retreat, to comply without being asked. HOA Karen didn't need to confront most residents directly because she had trained them to police themselves. When intimidation through paperwork wasn't enough, she escalated through outsourced authority. The HOA contracted a private security company, ostensibly for patrols and safety, but in practice, the guards acted as her personal extensions. They wore uniforms designed to resemble law enforcement, carried themselves with exaggerated seriousness, and lingered just long enough to make people uncomfortable. They recorded interactions, followed residents on walks, and delivered warnings that sounded official but carried no legal weight. HOA Karen used them to create distance between herself and the harm she caused, allowing her to enjoy the results without being seen as the source. The most insidious element of her structure, however, was her relationship with local police. HOA Karen cultivated it carefully, framing herself as a concerned community leader while quietly ensuring certain officers viewed her calls as priorities. She donated generously to police-related causes through the HOA, attended charity events, and spoke the language of cooperation and support. Over time, this created a dynamic where her complaints were treated as credible by default. Officers didn't arrive skeptical. They arrived already aligned with her narrative. That alignment was what allowed my daughter's arrest to happen without hesitation. This network of compliance fed on itself. Each successful display of power emboldened HOA Karen further. Each resident who backed down reinforced her belief that she was justified. She began to see resistance not as disagreement, but as defiance that needed to be corrected. The rules became secondary to her interpretation of them, and that interpretation always favored control. She didn't just enforce bylaws, she rewrote them in real time to suit her objectives, confident that no one would challenge her authority openly. The damage this caused rippled through the neighborhood quietly. People stopped speaking up in meetings, complaints went unfiled. Conversations about HOA overreach happened behind closed doors, in whispers, because residents had learned that visibility invited retaliation. HOA Karen relied on that silence. It allowed her to present the illusion of consensus while crushing dissent individually. From her perspective, this was governance. From mine, it was a classic abuse pattern scaled down to fit a cul-de-sac. My daughter's arrest was not an anomaly in this system. It was its logical endpoint. Once you normalize intimidation, once you reward escalation, the only direction left is outward. HOA Karen had exhausted fines, warnings, and embarrassment. In her mind, involving police was the ultimate confirmation of her power, the final step that proved she could reach beyond the HOA and command state authority. She never paused to consider whether she actually had the legal right to do so. She had been obeyed for so long that legality felt irrelevant. What made her structure particularly dangerous was how mundane it appeared. There were no dramatic threats, no overt declarations of dominance. Everything was couched in language about safety, standards, and community values. That camouflage is what allows abuse to persist longest. People doubt themselves when the harm comes wrapped in procedure. They question whether they are overreacting, whether they misunderstood, whether compliance would simply be easier. HOA Karen depended on that doubt, cultivated it, and exploited it ruthlessly. From the outside, her operation might have seemed petty, even laughable. To anyone trained to recognize power abuse, it was textbook. A central figure exerting control through intermediaries, insulating herself from direct accountability and leaning on friendly authorities to legitimize her actions. I had dismantled systems like this before at much higher levels, and the patterns were identical. Scale does not change nature. A tyrant with a budget of billions and a tyrant with a budget of HOA dues operate the same way when unchecked. By the time my daughter was handcuffed, HOA Karen had convinced herself she was untouchable. She believed her structure would protect her, that her relationships would shield her, and that the residents she intimidated would remain silent. She never considered that the very predictability of her system made it vulnerable. Every action she took left a trail. Every abuse created documentation. Every alliance produced evidence. She had built a machine that functioned smoothly only as long as no one with the authority and patience to dismantle it turned their attention inward. That was the moment everything shifted. Her power structure was no longer invisible to me. It was mapped, categorized, and ready to be exposed. HOA Karen still believed she was in control. She had no idea that the system she relied on was about to be examined not by frightened residents, but by someone who had spent a lifetime tearing down institutions that looked exactly like hers. Once the shock settled and the structure of HOA Karen's little kingdom was clear to me, emotion stopped being useful, and precision took over. Anger may ignite action, but it cannot sustain it, and I have never built a case on heat alone. That night after my daughter was home and the house was quiet again, I didn't pace or rant or replay the arrest in my head. I sat down and opened a mental file the same way I always do when a new investigation begins. Names, timelines, relationships, points of leverage. HOA Karen shifted herself from nuisance to subject, and subjects require documentation, not outrage. The first thing I needed was the paper trail, because people like HOA Karen always hide behind paperwork while simultaneously underestimating it. She believed forms protected her. In reality, they would expose her. I started with the incident itself, reconstructing the arrest minute by minute. Who called whom? What was said? What authority was claimed? Every official interaction leaves a record somewhere, and when you know where to look, silence is just as revealing as ink. I requested the police incident report through channels I knew would not stall or sanitize it. When it arrived, it was exactly what I expected. Vague, padded with subjective language, heavy on implication, and light on facts. Words like suspicious, uncooperative, and non-compliant appeared repeatedly, the linguistic fingerprints of an arrest built to justify itself after the fact. That report alone was enough to establish negligence, but negligence was not my target. I needed intent, coordination, and misuse of authority, and for that I needed the body camera footage. Body cameras are supposed to protect citizens, but they also protect the truth, and the truth is merciless when people forget they're being recorded. When the footage was secured and I pressed play, the room felt colder. I watched my daughter standing under flashing lights, confused but composed, asserting her right to be on a public street. I watched the officer hesitate, not because he doubted the arrest, but because he was waiting for confirmation. And then I saw HOA Karen, just off to the side, inserting herself into the interaction with quiet confidence, guiding the situation without ever touching it directly. That footage was not ambiguous. It showed influence. It showed direction. It showed a private citizen shaping the actions of a state actor in real time. HOA Karen wasn't a bystander. She was a conductor, orchestrating the violation while maintaining plausible distance. She spoke in the language of authority without possessing it, and the officer deferred without verifying it. Every second of that interaction tightened the legal noose. By the time the cuffs went on, the crime had already occurred, not just against my daughter, but against the Constitution. With the incident established, I widened the scope. Abuses like this do not happen in isolation. They are the result of patterns that have gone unchallenged long enough to grow bold. I began pulling HOA records, meeting minutes, financial disclosures, contracts, anything that could reveal how decisions were made and who benefited from them. HOA Karen had been meticulous in documenting compliance, but sloppy in documenting motive, a common mistake among small-scale tyrants. She assumed no one would ever look closely enough to care. That assumption is fatal. The contract with the private security firm was particularly revealing. On paper, it outlined limited patrol duties and observation only. In practice, complaints and internal notes suggested a much broader role, one that blurred the line between observation and enforcement. Reports referenced coordination with HOA leadership and responding to directive requests, phrases that mean nothing until you place them next to real-world outcomes like intimidation and detention. HOA Karen had built herself a shadow enforcement arm and left fingerprints all over it. Next came the financial records, and here the story sharpened quickly. Donations to police-affiliated funds routed through HOA accounts. Event sponsorships approved without meaningful board oversight. Expenses justified as community relations that coincidentally aligned with favorable treatment. None of it was overtly illegal in isolation, but legality is rarely about isolation. It is about aggregation, about patterns that reveal intent. When you stack enough coincidences together, they stop being coincidental. I also began documenting resident complaints that had never gone anywhere. Emails dismissed, formal grievances buried, warnings issued to those who spoke too loudly. Each one alone looked like a disagreement. Together, they painted a clear picture of retaliation and suppression. HOA Karen didn't just punish rule violations, she punished dissent. That distinction matters, because dissent is protected, and punishing it invites scrutiny from places far larger than an HOA board. As the night wore on, the legal framework crystallized. This was not simply a wrongful arrest or an overzealous HOA president. This was a deprivation of rights under color of authority, compounded by conspiracy. The officer acted as a state agent. HOA Karen acted as the instigator. Their coordination transformed a baseless stop into a constitutional violation. Federal law is explicit about this, and it does not care whether the violator holds office in City Hall or a suburban clubhouse. Authority abused is authority abused, regardless of scale. By the early hours of the morning, the case had structure. Evidence was categorized, timelines aligned, witnesses were identified. HOA Karen still believed she was untouchable, still sleeping comfortably under the assumption that the worst she faced was an angry parent or an annoyed board member. She had no idea that while she rested, every action she had taken was being reframed through statutes she had never read and consequences she had never imagined. Proof is not dramatic. It doesn't shout or threaten. It accumulates quietly until denial becomes impossible. By the time the sun began to rise, I wasn't wondering whether HOA Karen had crossed a line. I knew exactly how many lines she had crossed, in what order, and which ones would bring her entire structure down. The discovery phase was complete. What came next would no longer be private, and it would no longer be controlled by her. By the time morning arrived, the case was no longer theoretical. It was operational. HOA Karen still believed she was walking into court to argue bylaws, to posture, to perform the role she had rehearsed for years as the unquestioned authority of her neighborhood. She had no idea that the ground beneath her had already shifted, that the courtroom she saw as a stage was about to become a mirror she could not escape. I did not rush that morning. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already in motion, and haste only benefits people who are unsure of their footing. The courthouse has a rhythm you only notice if you've spent years inside it. The sounds, the pacing, the way conversations drop when certain people walk by. When I entered, there was no announcement, no pause, just a subtle recognition from the people who understood what presence meant. This building was not neutral territory for me. It was an environment I knew intimately, one where procedure bends naturally toward clarity if you know how to apply pressure. HOA Karen, on the other hand, arrived like a tourist, confident but unaware of how exposed she already was. She stood in the hallway with her attorney and a few board members, holding court in the way she always did, speaking loudly enough to be overheard, projecting certainty, as if volume alone could make it real. Her posture was relaxed, her tone indulgent, already savoring the outcome she assumed was inevitable. She believed she was the plaintiff, the aggrieved party, the one whose authority would be affirmed by a judge. She did not notice me at first. and that was intentional. Letting people exist comfortably inside their delusions before dismantling them was always more effective. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings were exactly as predictable as I expected. HOA Karen testified with practiced confidence, framing herself as a steward of order and values, painting minor resistance as existential threats to community harmony. She spoke in absolutes, exaggerated timelines, and moral language designed to elevate herself above scrutiny. She was comfortable lying because no one had ever forced her to confront consequences for it. Watching her speak under oath with such ease was not shocking. It was confirming. The judge listened with detached patience, the way judges do when they sense there is more beneath the surface than what is being presented. HOA Karen mistook that patience for approval. She mistook silence for agreement. Her attorney guided her through testimony smoothly, careful not to probe too deeply, careful not to ask questions that might invite clarification. They were managing an image, not a truth. That strategy only works when no one else in the room knows how to disrupt it. When the recess was called, the shift was immediate. HOA Karen stepped into the hallway buoyant, already celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. This was the moment I chose to enter her awareness. I approached without urgency, without anger, and without raising my voice. I addressed her by name. She turned with mild irritation, expecting another complaint, another resident she could dismiss. Instead, she saw someone who wasn't asking. I introduced myself simply, stating my name and the fact that she had my daughter arrested the day before. The reaction was not immediate on her face, but it was on her attorney's. I watched recognition hit him in stages, watched the confidence drain as he recalculated everything he thought he understood about the situation. He knew exactly who I was, or at least what I represented. HOA Karen did not. She was still operating under the assumption that authority is something you can declare. When she responded dismissively, it confirmed what I already knew. She did not understand the gravity of what she had done. I didn't correct her right away. Instead, I addressed her attorney, calmly outlining the facts as they existed, not as she wished them to be. A private citizen, a state actor, a minor detained without probable cause, coordination, direction, violation. I spoke in the language of statutes and consequences, not accusations. That language has weight, and it landed immediately. Her attorney tried to intervene, tried to pull her back, but she resisted, angered by the shift in tone. She demanded to know who I thought I was to lecture her. That was the moment everything crystallized. I looked directly at her and removed the last layer of ambiguity. I told her who I was, what unit I led, and what had already begun. I didn't threaten. I informed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The effect was immediate and irreversible. HOA Karen's expression changed in a way no performance can fake. Drained. Confidence collapsed. She looked to her attorney for reassurance and found none. Around us, the hallway had gone quiet. People sensed the rupture, the way predators sense weakness. This was not a public spectacle engineered for drama. It was a public realization that power had changed hands. I did not linger. Lingering invites argument, and argument implies uncertainty. I made a single call, issued a single instruction, and walked away. Behind me, HOA Karen stood frozen, her world unraveling in real time as the meaning of what I had said began to settle. She had walked into court, expecting validation. She left the hallway as a liability. That confrontation was not the end of her collapse. It was the beginning of its visibility. Everything that followed would be procedural, documented, and devastating. Her authority did not crumble because I embarrassed her. It collapsed because it was exposed to a system that does not tolerate impersonation. From that moment forward, HOA Karen was no longer in control of the narrative, the process, or her future. The courtroom had done what it always does when truth enters quietly. It removed the illusion and left nothing to hide behind. Once HOA Karen's illusion of control cracked in that courthouse hallway, the response moved out of the realm of conversation and into execution. This was the phase where systems answer systems, where experience matters more than emotion, and where pressure is applied so precisely that resistance becomes impossible. I did not need to improvise or experiment. I had run this playbook before, against people with far more resources and far less exposure. HOA. Karen was not facing retaliation driven by anger. She was facing institutional consequence driven by expertise. The first wave was designed to remove her ability to hide. Subpoenas were issued not selectively, but comprehensively, targeting every channel through which she exercised authority. Emails, meeting records, security contracts, financial accounts, and internal communications were all pulled simultaneously, leaving no time for coordination or cleanup. People who abuse power at small scales tend to assume they will be given warnings, that they will be asked politely to cooperate. They rely on delay. Delay is a luxury they lose the moment the law stops asking and starts taking. Investigators arrived not with questions but with documents. They were calm, professional, and indifferent to protest, because protest does not matter when compliance is compulsory. HOA Karen's home became a site of legal service rather than control. Her devices were no longer private. Her records were no longer hers. Every message she had ever sent in her capacity as HOA president was now subject to scrutiny by people trained to read between lines she didn't even realize she had written. At the same time, her enforcement network was neutralized. The officer who had arrested my daughter was placed under immediate internal review, not quietly, but formally and publicly within his department. Badge and weapons surrendered. Duties suspended. The signal this sends inside law enforcement is unmistakable. It tells everyone watching that this case is not routine, that the normal shields of solidarity and silence do not apply. Officers understand hierarchy, and they understand when scrutiny is coming from above them rather than beside them. The private security firm that had acted as HOA Karen's intimidation arm found itself under regulatory audit just as quickly. Their licensing, contracts, and incident reports were examined by people who do not accept vague explanations. Every overstep that had once been brushed aside as enthusiasm or miscommunication now had to be justified in writing. Every guard who had acted on HOA Karen's direction became a liability, and liability spreads fear faster than authority ever does. The most devastating pressure, however, came from the place HOA Karen least understood: insurance and financial exposure. The HOA's liability carrier was formally notified of the investigation and the potential for civil rights violations. This was not an accusation, it was a fact-based disclosure, and insurers react to facts with ruthless efficiency. Coverage that HOA Karen assumed would protect her began to evaporate under exclusions for intentional misconduct. Suddenly, the consequences were no longer abstract or theoretical. They were personal, financial, and immediate. The board members who had once nodded along in meetings now faced the reality of individual exposure. People who tolerate abuse while it benefits them rarely tolerate it when it threatens their savings, their licenses, and their homes. Phones rang. Attorneys were consulted. Distances were created. HOA Karen discovered very quickly that authority built on fear collapses the moment fear changes direction. Loyalty dissolved into self-preservation, and self-preservation does not leave room for kings. Behind the scenes, witnesses began to surface. Some came reluctantly, some eagerly, all carrying pieces of the same story. Patterns emerged, corroborated not by emotion but by timestamps, receipts, and recorded directives. Each account added weight, not drama. This was not about revenge. It was about inevitability. Once the machinery of oversight engages fully, it does not stop because someone feels embarrassed or remorseful. HOA Karen attempted to respond the only way she knew how, with bluster, indignation, and claims of misunderstanding. None of that mattered anymore. She was no longer speaking to residents she could intimidate or officers she could charm. She was speaking into a process that does not respond to tone, only to evidence. Every attempt she made to reassert control only generated more material for the record. What she failed to grasp until it was far too late was that expert retaliation does not look like punishment. It looks like procedure. It advances quietly, relentlessly, and without emotion. There are no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no final speeches. There is only the steady removal of options until the only thing left is compliance or collapse. By the time HOA Karen understood this, her ability to influence outcomes had already been stripped away. This phase was never about making her suffer publicly. It was about ensuring she could never harm anyone this way again. The difference matters. Public humiliation fades. Structural consequence endures. By the end of this stage, HOA Karen was no longer a figure of authority, no longer a decision-maker, and no longer protected by the systems she once manipulated. She was a subject, isolated and exposed, waiting for a resolution she could no longer control. The end of HOA Karen's reign did not arrive with sirens, headlines, or spectacle, and that was exactly how it should have been. Power abusers like her imagine their downfall as something dramatic, something loud enough to feel important, because they cannot conceive of a world where they are simply reduced to irrelevance. What actually happens, when systems finally do their work, is far quieter. The noise disappears first. The phone stops ringing. The emails go unanswered. The authority they once exercised evaporates without ceremony. By the time formal outcomes began to solidify, HOA Karen was already isolated. The board that once deferred to her had distanced itself entirely, issuing statements that mentioned process, but never her name. The security firm she relied on cut ties as soon as scrutiny intensified, eager to preserve its own survival. Even the officers who once responded eagerly to her calls avoided association, understanding instinctively that proximity now carried risk. She had not been overthrown. She had been abandoned. The legal consequences unfolded methodically. There were no theatrics, no grand pronouncements, just findings, determinations, and resolutions that closed doors one by one. Authority she once claimed vanished from official records. Privileges she had taken for granted were revoked quietly. The HOA itself, hollowed out by resignations and liability exposure, ceased to function as an enforcement body. Meetings were canceled. Notices stopped appearing. The structure that had enabled her behavior collapsed under its own weight, not because it was attacked emotionally, but because it was no longer viable. HOA Karen herself became smaller in every practical sense. She stopped attending public functions. Her name disappeared from correspondence. When she did appear, she did so cautiously, without the posture that once defined her presence. People who had once avoided her gaze now looked through her. There is a particular kind of humiliation in that shift. The realization that the fear you cultivated no longer exists. It does not announce itself. It simply leaves. The neighborhood changed subtly at first. Residents spoke more freely. Small acts of autonomy reappeared without permission being sought. No one celebrated openly because celebration implies struggle, and the struggle was over. The absence of control was enough. What had once felt oppressive now felt neutral, and neutrality is freedom when you've lived under scrutiny. The environment reset itself without needing direction. My daughter returned to her routine without fanfare. The street she jogged down did not change, but her relationship to it did. There were no patrols watching her, no eyes measuring her presence. She moved without hesitation, without the tension that had crept into her posture after the arrest. She didn't need reassurance. She didn't need explanations. The restoration of normalcy spoke for itself. As for me, there was no sense of triumph to process. I did not feel victorious in the way stories often demand. I felt resolved. The boundary that had been violated was restored. The abuse that had been normalized was removed. That was enough. I closed the file the same way I always do when a matter is finished, without reflection or indulgence. Closure does not require commentary. HOA Karen did not apologize publicly. She did not issue statements or explanations. She simply faded out of relevance, and in the end, that was the most complete outcome possible. There were no lessons delivered, no warnings issued, no moral summaries offered. The system responded, adjusted, and moved on. So did everyone else. The street stayed quiet after that. No one knocked on doors. No one enforced silence. The authority that once hovered over every interaction was gone, replaced by something far more durable: indifference. HOA Karen went silent.